Hello and welcome to another AIIA webinar. My name is Bryce Wakefield and I am the National Executive Director of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. Well, we live in an increasingly interconnected world, and for many countries, our increased interconnectedness is causing problems with our democracy. There are scourges like disinformation, and other problems that come along with the increasingly interconnected world that we live in. Taiwan, however, seems to be bucking the trend and has integrated strategies that have allowed it to use new technologies, the internet, to enhance its democracy. So to talk about that today, we have our good friend, Dr. Florian Schneider, back with us for a second webinar. Hi, Florian, how's it going?
Hi, Bryce, it's going good. Thanks for having me again.
So Florian is a Universitair Hoofddocent, a senior lecturer at the Leiden Leiden University Institute for Asian Studies. He's also the the director of the Leiden Asia Center. He's the managing editor of Asiascape Digital Asia, that's an academic journal, and he's the author of 3 books: Staging China, The Politics of Mass Spectacle, China's Digital Nationalism, which I have right here, and another book whose title I don't have in front of me, but it's on the politics of visuality in television in China. But today he's going to talk about Taiwan, so I shall pass the floor over to Florian.
Well, thank you very much. And thanks everyone for watching, for joining us here. I know it's a different time for you than it is for me here. For me, it's early morning. Let me share my screen with you and I'll show you a couple of slides of what I have been working on over the past, I would say, a year or so. So this is part of a research project that I conducted in 2019, where I went to Taiwan and I spent half a year there talking with people about digital democracy, about democracy more generally, some of the challenges that Taiwan faces and how people have been addressing those challenges. And specifically what inspired that project originally was the 2014 Sunflower Movement. So I don't know how familiar you are with Taiwan and with Taiwanese politics, but this really was a watershed moment in 2014 where led to a large extent by students, by university students and high school students, a large number of people from Taiwan came together to challenge the conservative Ma Ying-jeou administration. So that's the KMT at the time, the Kuomintang government, based on a decision that it had made to pass a cross-strait trade agreement with China, with mainland China. And the contention was, or actually there were a number of issues in play, which already gives us an impression of how complicated politics are in Taiwan. One was that this would be tantamount to selling out Taiwan to Chinese companies and opening the door to Chinese influence, so sort of an international relations issue and dynamic. But there was also the issue that the Ma Ying-jeou government had pushed through this particular agreement without consultation and without consulting the legislature and citizens more broadly. So people felt cheated in their understanding of what they felt democracy should be. And so they took to the streets to challenge the government, and the trade law had to be pulled back. And ultimately, this protest was probably a major part of what caused the Kuomintang its next election, both the local elections that followed soon after, and then its presidential election, and brought the opposition party into power in 2016. And one of the things that I was trying to figure out as I was in Taiwan doing my field research was what were the legacies of that particular movement. So that was one of the foundational questions for me. Did we see any impact on democratic politics in Taiwan after this particular event? And the short answer to that is yes, but I also wanted to find out what role did digital technology play, what kind of practices emerged, and what can that tell us more generally about democratic politics in the information age? So is there something that we could generally learn from the way that, whether it was activists or policymakers or administrators, how they all dealt with this new expectation in Taiwan about politics? And that meant that I was conducting interviews. I talked to a total of 15 people. And so for extended periods of time, detailed qualitative interviews that included people from a hackers collective I'm going to mention in a moment that was very influential during all of these processes, artists who were involved with the movement, activists, but also academics who had studied these different dimensions, and of course policymakers and administrators who had to react to the situation during the Sunflower Movement and then afterwards develop policies that they felt would address the expectations and needs of citizens. While most of my interviewees, I left them the option to stay anonymous, and many of them took that opportunity. Some actually said it's fine to be identified. So just to give you an impression of the kind of people I talked to, two people who were so kind to be identified were the two Taiwanese cyber ministers. I'm putting that in quotation marks because that's not an official job description. But the first is Jacqueline Tsai, who was a minister without a portfolio in 2013 to 2016 under the Ma Ying-jeou government. So she was in a position that dealt with information communication technologies and to some extent also trade issues during the time of the Sunflower Movement, and was one of the people who reacted directly to the way that the public was coming together and was asking, how can we make government more transparent? How can we make it more accessible to citizens and avoid these kind of problems that now this service trade agreement had caused? And in order to do that, she approached a hacker collective called GovZero, of which Audrey Tang was one member. That's the lady on the right-hand side here, who then helped Jacqueline Tsai put together various kinds of digital initiatives in order to make government more transparent. And after the Kuomintang government got replaced with the DPP government in 2016, Audrey Tang got hired to also take on a ministry without portfolio position, and is now, until this present time, still the so-called cyber minister of China, is also responsible for intergenerational debates and discussions, which is a crucial topic I'll come back to in a moment. So that's sort of the kind of people I was interviewing and asking, how are you doing your job? What brought you to push these certain issues, and what are you doing about it? And as I was talking with these various people, first of all, I asked them, what are the risks and challenges in Taiwanese society that you identify at the moment? Many of these you will recognize because they are similar across advanced industry, advanced economies, and advanced information systems and advanced liberal democracies. But some of them are also quite peculiar to the Taiwanese case. I think we can nevertheless learn quite a lot about these issues. One is the polarization that people in Taiwan associate it with politics. And this has a lot to do with the way that the Taiwanese political system is set up. I'll show you in a moment a quick graphic about the party landscape. But essentially, it's a model. It's modeled on a presidential system. So it also has two large parties at the core of Taiwanese politics. So the conservative KMT and the progressive democratic DPP. And people fall along a sometimes quite clear and often quite vocal spectrum between left and right. I'll show you in a moment also how that's a bit of a simplification, but it leads to situations where, particularly on contested issues, there can be quite a lot of shouting across the aisles. And that polarization was particularly visible in 2018 when the Taiwanese government, and this was now the DPP, was trying to pass a law on marriage equality, so an LGBT plus issue. And the DPP had been pushing LGBT issues throughout its election campaign. A lot of the people involved with the Sunflower Movement were also supportive of LGBT issues. So this was, especially for younger people, a pretty clear-cut case. Why not have marriage equality? But at the same time, there are also more conservative forces in Taiwan who felt that marriage should be an issue between clearly defined heteronormative genders, and that should be the end of the story. So these folks were demonstrating against each other effectively. And there was a referendum in 2018 which the DPP and supporters felt was going to be a pretty clear-cut case. And it turned out they had completely underestimated the conservative forces in Taiwan who were against gender equality and who turned out in droves and actually won the referendum. And part of the reason that happened, or why the DPP was so blindsided, was that a lot of what went on in the conservative camps didn't happen on Facebook. So they didn't actually see the discontent because they were looking in the wrong places and were looking at mostly certain digital platforms and forums where conservatives weren't present. And so they got blindsided by that issue. And it raised again, the debate about what it is to do democratic politics, because the DPP ultimately pushed through its bill and went with gender equality and marriage equality on LGBT plus rights anyways, despite the referendum having gone the other way. And that caused a lot of criticism also among people who were in fact LGBT activists saying, no, this is not how we should be doing that. If you have a referendum, you kind of have to somehow accommodate the people who now voted, don't you? So the argument then also from critics of the DPP was that effectively it was doing the same thing that the KMT had been doing, which is democracy is only convenient when it helps those in power. And so the debate is ongoing in Taiwan of how to actually make sure that democracy works properly and no one just becomes or slides into sort of a Machiavellian framework of just utilizing democratic channels for their own purposes. And the LGBT issue was indeed one that shone a spotlight on that. In terms of the conservative camp, so in this polarization, you get the young, you get the liberal folks on the one hand, and you get significantly older, I'll say something about that in a moment, conservatives who are often religiously motivated. There's strong religious movements in Taiwan. Christianity can be quite conservative in some of the churches there. And you also get influences, groups from outside of Taiwan that then try to influence and push these various groups. And I'll say something about that when we talk about disinformation, because that's a crucial concern there as well. So overall, you get a split, which isn't always neatly left-right. I actually had a lot of people who I talked to tell me that in their assessment, neither the DPP nor the KMT, so neither of the two big parties are actually left, that both are conservative. It's just the KMT is conservative in the way that it tries to conserve an ideal of mainland Chinese culture and of economics or conservative economics, whereas the DPP is conservative in a kind of localist Taiwanese way. So that a lot of the younger people felt there really wasn't all that much in terms of the party spectrum that represented them, unless you take some of the smaller, newer parties that are trying to push a left-wing agenda. But the big elephant in the room is, of course, cross-strait relations, where the divide is then between unification and independence. And while most people take a stand that is status quo oriented, so again, a more conservative position, there are younger people who are pushing for more independence and autonomy for Taiwan. And then one of the fault lines we see is generational. So you have an older generation where, in their experience, the divide in Taiwan was really between people who had arrived in Taiwan after the Civil War and who were considered quote unquote mainlanders, and the people who were already there who were considered then more Taiwanese, and that sort of created a tension. And for the younger generation, so people under the age of around 35, that doesn't seem to be the major fault line of politics anymore. And there are still some people who view themselves as leaning in the direction of feeling Chinese, but overall there seems to be a general consensus that being from Taiwan is something that this entire generation shares. And you see this then also in surveys. I'll show you one in a moment. But what the problem then is that the older generation and the younger generation don't seem to have much in common in terms of the language that they speak and the issues that they're trying to address. For a lot of younger people, the problems in Taiwan are socioeconomic. The outlook of being able to graduate from university or from some good school and then getting a decent job, that is not something that's guaranteed anymore. A lot of people are looking at lower to lower middle income positions, which is very frustrating considering the work and the investment they put into their education. So that is simply society not delivering on promises that people felt that they were given. Then there's a lot of people who are switching tracks and are trying to find different ways of having a good life. For example, in large cities like Taipei, younger people, there's a real environment of more bohem folks who, for example, frequent coffee stores and art houses and so on, and whose dream it is to, for example, establish their own little coffee place. And as that is becoming increasingly more difficult, it means that people feel switched off from society. So that is one of the major grievances socioeconomically, and it's very difficult to communicate that to an older generation who still felt that their career was basically on track and they would have a job for life and so on. Not maybe all that dissimilar from the shifts that we see in other places around the world, but the age divide is also significant in Taiwan, so this becomes a real problem. You see in terms of the identity, self-identification, I should say, between folks who identify as Taiwanese and folks who identify as Chinese, how the increase has been significant on who considers themselves to have a more local identity. And while there's still a large gap here of people who consider themselves to somehow be both or don't necessarily see themselves in this lens of bipolar opposites, overall, you see particularly 2014 when the Sunflower Movement happened, there was a real spike of people seeing themselves as primarily Taiwanese and then viewing politics through that lens. So that's something to keep in mind. In terms of disinformation, that was the other major problem that people identified for me, that they felt that there were influences from outside of Taiwan that were trying to push a wedge between these already existing polarities and drive people apart and essentially dismantle democracy from inside. And we now have very good evidence that that was particularly the case with Chinese influencers. So we have people associated potentially with either the CCP or the PLA, but we can tell from social media records and from IP addresses that there was a very strong effort by Chinese forces to unhinge democratic processes, particularly during moments like elections and referenda, where you then see spikes of misinformation that is being seeded. But it's not all digital. So you also had people indeed go to churches, go to community halls, and physically tell people that, say, gay people are diseased. And that means that they shouldn't be supporting any kind of LGBT rights issues. And so it's extremely difficult to track where some of these dimensions are coming from. It's not all Chinese. I mean, we know that Russia has an interest in dismantling anything that is democratic, but you also have alt-right folks from the United States who are intervening on conservative grounds in these kind of discussions and are seeding disinformation. And there's an entire political economy that benefits financially from doing that without any particular political allegiances. So this is a multifarious and difficult problem. And it gets aggravated in the Taiwanese case by the rise, at least at the time in 2018-19, by populism and by a particular politician called Han Kuo-yu, who from the south of Taiwan, who looked like he might actually win the election and then ultimately lost for a number of reasons. But he was on the radar as sort of a Taiwanese Trump with his misogyny and his aggressive racism and crude remarks. So this is sort of the situation that interviews were pointing out to me. And then I then asked them, okay, so what are you doing about this? What are some of the lessons that you've drawn? And one of the issues that people have been doing is invest in civic tech. And that is particularly true for the hacker collective surrounding GovZero and the various people associated with them, and trying to find technological solutions that would address some of these imbalances. And one of the things that I think the folks in Taiwan who are involved in this way have understood, and that departs quite markedly from what I see here in Europe, also of my own students. When I ask people here how they see technology, usually they think technology is neutral. It depends on what you do with it. And that is simply not the way that most scholars now see technology, and also not the way that activists in Taiwan view technology, because they understand that design matters. You can design for certain outcomes. This is a picture, a contested one, by the way, about New York and the New York urban planner Moses, who built highways and bridges to Long Island at the time. And the bridges were built so low that buses couldn't go under them, which prevented people who would use buses, public transport, from reaching the rich areas in Long Island. And one scholar in particular is famous for having made this argument that basically racism was built into the infrastructure of the highway system in upstate New York, in New York and Long Island. And in that sense, technology and design actually has very real social impacts, and it is already built to have these impacts. And we can then also conversely do the opposite and try to build for civic engagement. And that's precisely what the folks in Taiwan are doing. For instance, they have do-it-yourself environmentalist technology that they're spreading. This is coming from the New Power Party. That's an initiative that involves also a private company that is building cheap, affordable sets for building air pollution detectors, and high schools, elementary schools are having their students make these and then crowdsource the experience of seeing what air pollution looks like in Taiwan. So that is both a environmentally or an effort to create environmental consciousness, but also an effort to create digital literacy, and to, through both of these angles, in a crowdsourced manner, get people involved. Just as one example, like crowdsourcing is generally a big issue or a big deal in Taiwan, and a go-to strategy. This is an app that a group of hackers created in order to fight rumors and misinformation online. It ties in with the Japanese chat app Line, which is the biggest chat app in Taiwan also. And if you see a piece of information in your chat app that seems dubious, you can activate the bot that the Kofacts people created in order to fact check it. And here, this is really important. The lesson is not just that if you confront misinformation with true information, with the facts, then the problem goes away, because the people who built this app understand that it is not sufficient to tell a Trump supporter or a Brexit supporter or whoever you have who is believing in something completely false and demonstrably false, that they are wrong. That's not going to solve the problem. They're not going to take away the lesson that they were wrong and now change their mind. The point is to create an atmosphere of discussion in which people understand what the nature of knowledge is, and to understand where information comes from and how we should all be having a discussion with each other of what is and isn't plausible. So to increase dialogue, essentially. So through this crowdsourcing application, the designers are trying to facilitate precisely this. And that's also the lesson that those have learned who are creating technology for participation. For example, using a tool that's actually not Taiwanese originally, but that's heavily deployed in Taiwan called Polis, which allows people to enter either solutions to certain policy problems or policy suggestions. And what happens is that you can upvote other people's suggestions. You cannot downvote anything, you cannot dislike something, and you cannot engage in discussion and start yelling at people. All of these mechanisms are removed from the platform. The only thing you can do is you can agree that this is a good issue that should now be addressed in a forum somewhere and treated properly. And then that moves to a different forum or to a different mode of engagement. And the effect is that social groups and society more broadly starts to home in on what Audrey Tang, who's a big proponent of this, calls the low-hanging fruit. So the kind of topics that don't get people enraged, that are not bipartisan, or that work across partisan divides, that are not polarized in the same way, and in that way try to start addressing issues and get a process started rather than getting divided over the long tail of issues that may not be the most important thing to address. And that is then also visible in various online platforms that Taiwan has rolled out, whether it is on the government side, that's the lower left here, or in a combination with civil society actors, that's V-Taiwan on the top, which walks people through a process of engagement, starting with defining the issue, then elaborating and collaborating on it in order to develop it into a policy, and then communicating it in a transparent way across various kinds of digital solutions, and to take these issues to people who are not digitally plugged in. So Audrey Tang and her team go to various city halls around Taiwan, and speak to people there in person, bring the technology, and then stream those conversations to stakeholders in Taipei who are forced to respond to people who say, you know, we don't like this particular traffic rule, do something about it. And so in that sense, you don't have to be digitally literate in order to participate in these various processes. I'm almost out of time, so I just want to say a couple of things here on how the activists and people involved have been trying to change the script of how people think about politics, for example, by trying to cross the divides between generations by reframing issues and saying, well, how about we treat the kind of dialogue that, instead of attacking each other across these divides, we're going to create tools, texts, arguments that people can use, that young people can carry back home into their home and say, you know, hey, grandpa, I want to have a discussion with you about this issue, and to approach it in a way that is designed by sociologists and psychologists in a way that emphasizes engagement and respect rather than just divides. And to also then do that across ideological issues. This is an LGBT advocacy site where you can petition your local politician for gender rights and LGBT rights. And it has as its slogan, this is on the top here, I don't know how many of you read Chinese, I love my family, or I love family. And they explicitly, the group who did this site did this in order to emphasize that, yes, queer folks also care about family. If you're a conservative, that's something you should be able to recognize, and to try and switch the debate and put it on grounding, on footing that everyone can relate to, whether they like the issue or not. And the state also does, the state officials, with its public service announcements, for example, taking a more fun, humorous approach to things. This is coronavirus information on how to wash your hands and how to take a good rest and keep the window open, all these different things, communicated in the through this mascot, this little dog, which contrasts markedly, and this must also be clear to people who see these things, with the propaganda coming out of China on COVID-19, which was very, very nationalistic and top-down, and didn't have the same kind of self-deprecating humor. So the approach is effectively what advocates call mimetic. It uses memes, and it uses self-deprecating humor. So for example, to fight misinformation, to say, look, we have a piece of a misinformation here. It's saying our government is going to pass a law that fines people who use hair product, because hair product is something that now the government doesn't want anymore. That is blatantly false. So we're going to immediately put out a meme that goes on social media, poking fun at the issue and at ourselves by saying, actually, we have a law. It's a law that's preventing people from selling hair products that are toxic. That's the law. If you're using hair product, you're not going to get fined. And me personally here as the prime minister who is supporting this, look at me. I used to have beautiful hair like this. Obviously, I'm not going to begrudge anyone their beautiful hair. So nothing's going to happen here. But if you take disgusting poisonous hair product, then in the end, you know, you might end up looking like me. So don't do that. And so by using a meme like that, it immediately pokes fun at the issue. And the argument is that by using humor, it doesn't really matter whether people now say, okay, so the information is true or false. They immediately realize it's just silly. It's a silly issue. Why should I get upset and enraged about something that is this silly? And so to sort of undermine the entire premise of the rage economy. So let me just conclude by saying that in Taiwan, one thing that people there share is a general conviction to democratic process, and that may not be the case in some other societies. There's a general trust that despite all these divides, we can generally trust people to come together and have a conversation, that should be the norm and that should be a major value. There's also an understanding that technology should be a facilitator in this process, that technology isn't either good or bad, but it's also not neutral. So you can design for certain ends. And you should do so probably in a way that emphasizes taking a step back, particularly for people in power. So this is a very Taoist and also a very anarchist approach of not taking action and letting people come together and inform decisions through their dialogue. And that's what's called in Chinese Wu Wei, and it's a sort of a contemporary interpretation of Taoist principles. And then there's I'm not going to read the quote to you because of time reasons, but there's the understanding that there's a difference between top-down techniques of governing and bottom-up techniques of governing. And that where previous scholars would have said the bottom-up techniques don't work if you are doing them at scale, if it involves more people. What we're seeing in Taiwan now is, first of all, you can in fact involve more people in democratic techniques, but you can also focus more on the local context and local environments, on issue areas in ways that don't necessarily require everyone to get involved. It should require the people who are affected to get involved. And in order to facilitate that, it requires different kinds of dialogue. And finally, it's important to start at small scales with the low-hanging fruits, as it were, in order to get small things done and get the process started and inspire a particular mode of engagement, rather than trying to get hung up on the really controversial issues. Which isn't to say that in Taiwan, we don't also still see an uphill struggle to make all of this happen. I've talked to many people who were disillusioned with the process, who felt that there was just nothing they could do against this political economy of rage, that commercial social media was simply getting in the way, and using them in order to reach any kind of audience was automatically pushing a simplistic narrative on politics that didn't do issues justice, that people were ultimately trapped in their ideological bubbles, that the threat of misinformation was becoming so existential that it was fueling so many anxieties that even political parties themselves were using the allegation of misinformation to shut each other up and censor each other, so that there's still a whole lot that needs to be solved. But I'm hoping that by just narrating some of these solutions to you and some of the things that people are doing, we can have a conversation in a moment of how this might scale and might extend to other societies other than just digital Taiwan. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to hearing your comments.
Right, thank you very much, Florian. Now, to remind everybody, you can of course ask Florian questions by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. When you wave your mouse over the screen, it should appear. Yeah, here you can upvote things as well. So if you see a question you like, click on the thumbs up, and if enough people click on it, it'll float to the top of the pack. But I'm going to go with my question first. I mean, you seem to be suggesting here that Taiwan is either a unique case or a special case or a leader in this area. I'd like you to just, I don't think you really explained why this is so. What are the factors that make Taiwan such a success in terms of online engagement in Taiwan's democracy? But also I do want to address the issue that you brought up at the end. If Taiwan, if there is something special about Taiwan, then how scalable is this? Does it mean that it may be hard, if there are special circumstances in Taiwan, it's going to be harder to integrate the sort of techniques that you're talking about into societies like Holland or Australia or the United States?
Yes, excellent question. I should point out that I always hesitate to describe anything as a unique case because, I mean, Bryce will sympathize with me on this because he's a Japan scholar, that down that road may lie Orientalist fantasies of how somehow Taiwan is special because it's in the East somewhere and it's Asian and all these kind of issues, which is not to say, however, that of course every society has its own factors that shape it. So in that sense, either everything is unique or nothing. So I'm inclined to say we all have our unique aspects to our societies, and Taiwan isn't special for being Taiwanese. And there's one reason why I think there's something special here. But overall, many of the processes I'm describing now, they may form a relatively unique conflation of different issues that are coming together and that are being used in this particular way. But no single one of these items is unique to Taiwan. So we're also seeing, in fact, a lot of the originally the Taiwan, the sunflower movement, and then also many of the practices that have grown out of it were inspired by the Occupy movement in the United States. Or also, and this is a cross dialogue in Asia itself, these various demonstrations and the practices we see now are inspired by, for example, the events in Hong Kong, by the events in South Korea, people there demonstrating against the Park administration, and then learning lessons on how to be more participatory in events and social activities like that. So there's a dialogue. There's also a dialogue with European countries. I can't speak to Australia. I don't know how much Audrey Tang has been visiting Australia to talk about these things and what's happening there. But overall, I think the Taiwanese example is just a maybe a more advanced case of how people have taken the arguments about participatory democracy in a digital information age to logical conclusions that have not necessarily happened as a collective elsewhere. But individual cases you also see elsewhere. And that also, I think, then answers my question for you, Bryce, of whether I think this applies in other contexts. And I think it does. For the most part, it does. But you always have to tailor any kind of solution to a particular context. Because something like the generational divide and the way it works in Taiwan might not be the same issue that someone faces in Holland. So in that sense, a different kind of engagement in different issue areas might be relevant, but that doesn't mean that the general idea of bringing people together across ideological divides somehow falls away. I think that's something that is near universal. In terms of the one thing that I think is special about Taiwan, and that also means we should pay particular attention, is that for a lot of people in Taiwan, the issue of creating democratic politics has a different relevance than for people in other democratic countries, because it seems like an absolutely existential thing to do because of the cross-strait dynamic. So a lot of people in Taiwan are saying the one thing that distinguishes us from mainland China is that we have a different civic consciousness and a different polity. So we have to really, really protect that. And there's a very real sense that that is under threat and that is being attacked. And that's not just a fantasy, it's entirely true, because we see the influencers from mainland China trying to undermine exactly that system. We see the propaganda in China trying to express any kind of, well, reframe any kind of problem in Taiwan as a problem of the democratic system. So people in Taiwan know this, they're aware of this, and that means that they are maybe more capable or at least more willing to meet each other on the same fundamental basis that democracy matters. No matter where you stand on the political spectrum, also the people who are yelling at each other across political divides, Kuomintang and DPP, they all agree that it's important to have a lively party spectrum, to have lively discussions, to bring everyone into the fold of communicating, even if they hate each other's guts because of ideological reasons. And this is then the question, I don't have a good answer, of whether that then is a destination other societies can reach who may not have that kind of strong consensus because of outside pressure. One of the criticisms for applying this, for example, in the US is that the polarization there is so intense that you simply cannot bridge it through these smaller, lower hanging fruit kind of engagements. I would think it must be possible, but I'm not an expert on American politics, so I hesitate to make a strong statement about that. I hope that answers your question, Bryce.
Yep. It does indeed. But I mean, if we can circle back to something that you just said about the Chinese propaganda techniques, I'm wondering if there isn't a danger here when we rely so much on net engagement to kind of form a political discourse that that the narrative can't be hijacked and abused by, for example, the CCP. So, you know, Marion Library, for example, talks about one of our questioners asks, what is fact in the social world? One person's truth is another person's misinformation. I mean, can we not think of a scenario where malicious actors can hijack the system, or the system itself can be devalued by the fact that there are people who are asserting views that may not be accepted by a large majority of voters. Now, related to the China question, Zara Kimpton, who is our national vice president, asks if there have been any active threats to Taiwan's cybersecurity by China, which is a big issue here in Australia.
All right, I detect essentially three questions. I'm going to get to Zara Kimpton's question last, I think. But as you say, Mariana Ilbery, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing your name right, and your question kind of tie together. So there's the issue of if everything moves online so much and we're relying on these digital forums, can that discussion be hijacked more easily? And then the question is what happens when discussions, the question just got deleted. Oh no, I don't see it anymore. The question of whether or not one person's truth is another person's misinformation, right? So in terms of the overloading or the overemphasis of digital fora, the solution that the people who are using digital forums for discussion propose is kind of a radical transparency, which introduces yet another problem. So I'm not saying that this is the right way to do it. I'm just saying that there's a discussion of these tensions on how to solve them. And one is indeed, if you rely too much on digital technology, you invite potential abuse and manipulation. One important solution is to ground the digital discussion in real world discussion and realize that these are extensions. You cannot just have a Facebook discussion and treat it solely as the only thing that matters. That would be a mistake. You have to try and ground it in the actual still City Hall conversation and various other communication channels. And the other, what I just mentioned, is the focus on transparency by, for instance, having at least some kind of control over who contributes. Like, for instance, now at least checking IP and geolocation data to see where people are commenting from, and then saying, oh, it's very unlikely that we suddenly have all these aggressively anti-LGBT people commenting in from somewhere in Latin America, but all in simplified Chinese. What is happening here, right? And to extrapolate from that, it must be the Chinese government. Sorry, Bryce, were you going to say? Oh, okay. So that is one of the ways that people are now trying to approach that topic, through more transparency, and saying if we're having an open discussion and we're honest about where we're coming from, then we are not vulnerable in the same way to attack. I'm saying this is still a tension or still a problem because some people might need to be anonymous. There are issues that not everyone wants to voice freely, and transparency can also be a real risk. So, for example, if you are a minority group of some sort and you're vulnerable and you want to express your view, doing so in a way that is entirely transparent puts you in a risky position, potentially, social consequences and so on. So even if it's not top-down political consequences, you might face social consequences. What do you do about that? And I haven't seen a proper solution yet to how to balance that, how to square that circle. So that's the issue that Bryce raised. I wanted to speak to the topic of what happens when one person's truth is another person's non-truth. And there's no objective truth in that sense then. And I think it's important to realize there's two different approaches to misinformation. One is a rationalist approach and one is a reflective approach. Both play a role in Taiwanese politics, and I think we should also consider both elsewhere. The rationalist approach is to say, kind of what I described earlier, you confront people with the fact. And if you do that, you pull off the blanket off their eyes, you make them see the truth, and they will see the light. Problem solved. Right? And that's the kind of framework that informs fact-checking. So I'm not saying we don't need fact-checking, but clearly facts do matter. But the psychological dimension there is more complicated. And that's where the reflective approach comes in to say, no, we should probably not censor people for misrepresenting a certain fact, because down that way lies censorship more broadly, because you're not just censoring the fact, you're also censoring an argument. And people are making this argument for a reason, whether they're right or not. So we have to have a conversation about it and say, look, the fact you're using isn't correct, but I'm hearing you. What is this really about? Why are you upset about this? And can we somehow address that? And I've talked to people at, for example, ministries in Taiwan who have digital outreach on Facebook and through Line, and who are increasingly moving in the direction of doing that because they're seeing misinformation, misrepresentations of their policies in the public sphere and in online discourses. And instead of saying, no, you're wrong, this is the correct one, they're saying, okay, so this is not how it works, and I have an explanation for you, but my point is not to correct you here. My point is to hear what it is that you're trying to achieve. Can we have a conversation? And I think that's the more sensible way to treat misinformation. And if you do that, then also the trolls don't have much of a handle on you, because what's the point of them trolling you? You're getting the question back at you, okay, but what is it that you would like? And trolls are not very good at having that conversation in my experience. So I hope that answers that question. The other question was cybersecurity. I'm not an expert on cybersecurity, so I can't really comment, but I do have colleagues who work on this. And it seems like that is indeed a major issue. I know that the authorities in Taiwan are very concerned about cyber hacking and cyber intervention from foreign actors. And that, of course, major blip on the radar then is the PLA. But what exactly happens and how they handle that, I can't give you an answer to, because that's not quite my field, I'm afraid. I hope I've still answered the question a bit, Bryce.
Yes, yes, indeed you have. You've answered all three of them. Okay, we have two questions which are the same or similar from Catherine Reynoldson and Christian Hernandez, and they're talking about metrics. I mean, how do we know how effective these systems are? So, for example, Catherine asks, how is success measured by Audrey Tang and her team? How can we demonstrate the value in this new medium of engagement which wins hearts and minds? What sort of data do we have besides the systems? We can easily look at the systems themselves, I'm sure, but how do we know that it's actually having an effect on discourse in Taiwan?
Yeah, I actually have to admit, I don't have a clear answer on this myself. I'm going to take a note on this and put it back to some of the people I interviewed, because this is a really good point. There are metrics available for how many people engaged in any particular kind of issue, because that's all transparent. The back end there is transparent. It's an open question is, what does that really tell us about engagement more broadly? This is also a problem, and I'm not just then talking about Taiwan, but also of approaches like liquid democracy, which is very similar and is quite popular in Germany or certain parts of Germany. It's also somewhat popular, I think, in the Netherlands, of creating forums where people engage with policy platforms and push policies. And one of the classic criticisms from Europe, where we have some research on this, is that it tends to be people who look like me. So white, middle-aged, highly educated, digitally enabled men who are most represented in these platforms. And that creates a problem, because a lot of people then are switched out of the process. I have the impression that the Taiwanese discourse on public participation is generally better and more broadly established, also because so much of it isn't just focused on the digital. I've been talking a lot about the digital right now, but so when Audrey Tang, for instance, initiates various kinds of dialogue, or when the Gov0 people try to initiate a forum, they don't just do that online. They have quite literal spaces in Taipei where people come together across generations, and it's sort of a place where you can get your food and you can have a discussion in order to create a parallel place that ties in with the digital discussions and motivates people to have that conversation. And they also have events for senior citizens to come together and have that discussion, which isn't then necessarily digital, and to help each other out with younger generations, helping older generations on how to use the digital technology also. So that kind of is two birds with one stone, because first of all, you get more people to participate, and you get people to communicate with each other across these divides, and also for younger people to understand what are the problems that older people have with the system we're now using. So I think there's a lot more mechanics in place to address the issue, but whether or not, like, what the metrics is to actually measure success, I can't tell you right now. So I'm going to ask that again. I'm going to contact the folks then and check what numbers they have, because I know they do surveys, but I don't have that data. So yeah, sorry about that.
Okay, we got a question here, which is, I'm not sure if you can answer it. I think it's more about US politics than Taiwanese politics, but it comes from Amy Chavez. She was for 23 years a columnist in the Japan Times. I used to read her columns when I was living in Japan. but she's now got her own website called booksonasia.net, where she does have a lot of books on Asia and does reviews and can tell you what's coming up in the Asia space, I guess, the new book. So check that out. So Amy asks, what do you think is behind the alt-right in the US wanting to interfere with Taiwan democracy? Do you know anything about that, Florian?
This is extremely difficult. I've also asked similar things to my research collaborators, research participants. They've had different answers to this. The reason I say it's so complicated is because the alt-right in America has complicated international relations. So for instance, they are allied to some extent in mainland China with what is called the New Left in China, which are ardent, hardcore, orthodox Marxists, which is really bizarre. And you're wondering, how's that possible? But these are all people who hate liberals. So essentially their hatred towards liberal cosmopolitan elites is what drives that kind of connection. In the Taiwanese case, it's strange that you have populists in Taiwan who are serious Trump fans. So the kind of people who would vote for Han Kuo-yu are also Trump fans and are consequently quite close to the same ideals of what the alt-right in America represents. And I think that may be a vector for collaboration, and another vector might be Christian conservatism, so religious beliefs. At least that's one of the things that my interviewees kept pointing out. Again, this is where it's complicated because you have two different kinds of groups of Christians in Taiwan. You have more than two, but broadly speaking, two camps. One is the group that is more geared towards the KMT Blue camp, and another one is more of the evangelic, sorry, my language center is breaking down, group, which is more on the Taiwanese localist side and is more of a DPP group. But you can reach both of those groups through issues like traditional gender roles and traditional religious perceptions. And in those cases, it seems that the alt-right, through missionary practices also, has a foot in the door. And not all missionaries in Taiwan are alt-right, right? But they tend to be conservative. And there's quite a lot of missionary work happening in Taiwan. So I think my research participants are right to point that out as a connection. I don't know if I've properly answered Amy's question. It's also still a question mark for myself, on how that works.
I thought it was a great answer. Anyway, we have a slightly off-topic question. He says it's off-topic himself, from Sam Wade, but it is about Han Kuo-yu, who you've mentioned several times now, and he wants to know about Han Kuo-yu's election loss. What were the reasons for his defeat? He'd love to hear your opinion.
Oof, yeah. Difficult topic. I think he just became increasingly absurd in the things that he was representing. There seems to have been a spike sometime in spring 2019 where it looked like Han Kuo-yu might be winning. And where in particular the economic angle that he was representing of saying we need to work more with mainland China is going to help us out here in saving Taiwan's economy. And that had a lot of pull with blue-collar workers, particularly in the south of Taiwan. So that was the moment where people were getting very anxious, who were sitting anywhere else on the political spectrum, that Han Kuo-yu might actually win. And then throughout the rest of 2019, we actually see the popularity. Sadly, I don't have the graphic in front of me, but the polling and the popular opinion went apart quite sharply. And I think there's several factors. One seems to have been the awareness of a lot of people in Taiwan that Chinese influence was in fact a major problem. So even if they don't necessarily support independence, they wanted to make sure, a lot of people felt they needed to make sure that whatever government was in place wasn't going to handle these issues haphazardly. And Han Kuo-yu didn't really have a very convincing position and was flip-flopping back and forth and saying, no, I'm obviously also going to do that, but also more connection with China. And I think I vaguely recall also that there were arguments of whether he himself was too closely related to business people from mainland China, and that raised issues of personal of conflicts of interest. And then, he was just making more and more increasingly ridiculous statements. There was a moment where he was climbing on a tree to look for mosquitoes who were infecting people with dengue fever. and was sort of suggesting that climbing into a tree and looking for mosquitoes was a decent policy choice, and that you start losing your credibility. So I think he still had a hardcore group of fans who were committed, kind of like you also see hardcore Trump fans who are committed. But I think Taiwanese society switched a little bit back in the direction of saying, no, we actually need a more sensible and reasonable dialogue. And that kind of cost him a lot of votes. I'm probably missing important political developments towards the end of 2019, but at that point I was looking down the barrel of 80-hour teaching weeks. So I apologize if I wasn't entirely on top of what happened exactly in the run-up to the election. But by the time we reached the election, I don't think it was a major issue that Hangul would still win. So I hope I've addressed that question somewhat.
Great. We have a question here from Xiao Shui, who says, easily, how should the Netherlands and Taiwan cooperate to improve digital democracy or digital connectivity abroad and at home? I'm wondering, I mean, we will take the Netherlands as the case because, you know, you're familiar with the Netherlands. I won't ask you to talk about Australia, but if you were to pick a few or one major reform that that the Netherlands could emulate from Taiwan, or if there's other ways that the two countries could cooperate, what would be your suggestion?
I think I particularly like two dimensions of what I've now seen in the Taiwanese case. One is this mimetic approach to misinformation. And so the combination of fact-checking, forum, and self-deprecating humor in order to create an impression that everyone is available to have a discussion of what information is, how it works, and how we should reach consensus as societies. I think that is an extremely important step. We had Audrey Tang visit at some point to give a talk about this issue. And one of the things, and she's been to the Netherlands a number of times and to other countries as well, one of the things I noticed is how there seems to be quite a lot of enthusiasm in the audience for precisely these kind of ideas because they're extremely practical, they're very pragmatic, and there's small things that you can start almost immediately. And that hopefully then over longer extended periods of time, bring people back around the table to say, let's have a discussion about then also more difficult issues. And that's then the second point, and that is this lower hanging fruit approach. Though I hesitate a little bit because I am also still skeptical, and that was the question earlier, of whether doing that digitally might switch people off or switch them out of the discussion. And I think there has to be a holistic approach that says, and this is also something Taiwan did in the wake of the Sunflower Movement, we need a much clearer understanding of what it means to say a government is transparent. Because most governments now claim to be transparent. I can go on the website of Leiden City Hall, that's the city I live in, or the town I live in, and I can find every edict that gets passed in any capacity, and there's information of where I can go to the city hall during a certain moment of time to raise my hand and say I disagree. The problem is it's such a massive flood of information, and it's all in Dutch, that it leaves a whole lot of people switched off. And it also means that only very specific people who have the time, the energy, the education, and the access are able to participate in that way. And I think the Taiwanese approach is to try and address these issues in various ways, and that's where the dialogue has to happen. It's not enough to say we're going to introduce the polis model, so as a policy platform to discuss policies. We also have to give people the time and energy in order to make it possible for them to participate. So you're immediately looking at a much more holistic problem, where people who are constantly overworked simply can't take part in that. How do you fix that? How do you make sure that people are not overworked? And so having that discussion, I think, is very important. But as far as starting somewhere small, I think exactly this low-hanging fruit approach of saying, let's try and focus on one or two issues at a time, the ones that everyone should be able to get on board with. Let's let citizens themselves decide what they think that issues should be. And let's spread the information widely in ways that are both digital and non-digital to get everyone on board in many different languages, not just in the national language, but in all sorts of different languages. I think that's the right way to create that kind of dialogue.
Okay, we're going to be brushing up against the hour. So I'll say thank you now, Florian, for what has been a fascinating and penetrating talk.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you all for the wonderful questions and the discussion. That was a lot of fun. So yeah, thanks.
Yep. And we hope to see you down here God willing, at some stage.
Oh yeah, me too.
Okay, folks. So that's all we've got. If you'd like to check out our forward schedule of events, you can do so on internationalaffairs.org.au/events. internationalaffairs.org.au/events. Thank you all for tuning in, and thanks to Phoebe sitting on my right here. Phoebe Humphreys is my very capable communications assistant who has been pushing the buttons for me, and I hope to see you back here soon. September 30th, we have an event on Japan's multilateralism and security, and by Paul Midford, and that should be one to look out for. So see you all next time.